If you've ever had that feeling, that deep in your bones certainty that your life is finally on the right track, then you know what the last few years felt like for me. My name is Ellie, and until about 6 weeks ago, I believed I was living a life that I had meticulously, lovingly co-created. I had a husband, Richard, whose ambition was a force of nature, a beautiful home in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, and a sense of stability that felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. Richard was the charismatic CEO of his own tech startup, Innovate Dynamics, a company that had grown from a frantic, caffeine-fueled dream in our spare bedroom into a respected local enterprise. He was the sun, and I suppose, was a planet contentedly orbiting in his glow. He was my rock, my partner, my everything. At least, that's the story I told myself. It's funny how easily we can build a cathedral of lies around ourselves, polishing the stained glass windows so brightly that we never bother to look at the cracks forming in the foundation. But cathedrals, no matter how beautiful, can't withstand an earthquake. And my earthquake arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, disguised as a polite but firm knock on the front door. I remember the scent of lemon cleaner was still hanging in the air from my morning chores. I opened the door to two men in unremarkable suits. The older one, with tired eyes and a weary slump to his shoulders, introduced himself as Detective Harding. The younger one, sharp and alert, was Detective Chen. My first thought was that something had happened to Richard. My heart seized, a cold fist clenching around it. No, they assured me, Mr. Archer was fine. In fact, he was the one who had called them. They asked if they could come in. A few minutes later, I was sitting on my own beige linen sofa, the one Richard and I had spent a whole weekend picking out, and these two strangers were methodically dismantling my entire world. Detective Harding did most of the talking, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that seemed to absorb all the warmth from the room. He explained that a significant amount of money, nearly $500,000, had been embezzled from Innovate Dynamics over the last 4 months. The transfers were small at first, then grew in size and frequency, a classic pattern of escalating theft. I listened, my brow furrowed with a mixture of confusion and concern for Richard. He must be devastated, I thought. All his hard work, threatened by some faceless criminal. I asked them if they had any leads. And that's when Detective Chen slid a sheaf of papers across our polished oak coffee table. He tapped a neatly highlighted column. "Ma'am," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "these are the logs for the fraudulent transfers. They were all initiated from an IP address traced directly to this house." I stared at the papers. Numbers and dates swam before my eyes. It didn't make any sense. Hacked? Was our network compromised? My mind, with its dormant master's degree in cybersecurity, immediately started running through protocols, firewalls, potential vulnerabilities. And these, Detective Harding added, placing a second set of documents next to the first, are security logs from your husband's company. They're time-stamped, showing who was at their computer and when. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. Your husband was kind enough to provide us with the logs from your home security system as well. He turned a page, revealing a series of grainy black and white still images. There I was, clear as day, sitting in my home office, my face illuminated by the glow of my monitor. Each image was time-stamped, and each timestamp corresponded, to the second, with one of the fraudulent transfers. Just then, the front door opened and Richard rushed in. He looked frantic, his tie loosened, his hair artfully disheveled. He looked every bit the distraught husband. He rushed to my side, ignoring the detectives, and knelt before me. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice thick with a performance of anguish I would only later recognize for the masterpiece it was. "I don't understand. I told them there has to be a mistake. Tell them, honey, why would you do this?" He looked from me to the detectives, a picture of bewildered betrayal. And in that moment, as I stared into the eyes of the man I had loved for a decade, I saw it. It was a flicker, a brief, cold glint of triumph behind the carefully constructed mask of sorrow. He wasn't asking me a question. He was delivering a verdict. He had built the cage, locked the door, and was now feigning shock at finding me inside. He thought he was so clever. He thought he had created the perfect, unimpeachable digital trail. He didn't know that my boring Wednesday night book club was my salvation. He didn't know that for every single transaction he was trying to pin on me, I had a digital, time-stamped, and irrefutable alibi that would not only prove my innocence, but would become the very instrument of his destruction. The moments after Richard's dramatic entrance are a blur of muted sound and sharp, painful clarity. The detectives were speaking, their voices a low drone. Richard was consoling me, his hand on my shoulder, feeling less like a comfort and more like a brand. I felt like I was watching a scene from a movie where I was the unwilling star, cast in a role I didn't understand. They didn't arrest me, not yet. They called it an ongoing investigation. They took my statement, a jumbled mess of denials and confused disbelief that I'm sure only made me look guiltier. They told me not to leave town. Then they left, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any accusation. Richard immediately launched into his role as the supportive yet deeply wounded husband. He made tea, his movements practiced and solicitous. He kept saying things like, "We'll get through this, Ellie, and I know you've been under a lot of stress." He was already building the narrative for my defense, a defense based on me being fragile, unstable, not in my right mind. He was painting a portrait of a woman who had cracked under pressure, a pathetic creature to be pitied, not a criminal to be condemned. The first 24 hours were a private hell. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I paced the rooms of our perfect house, each object a testament to a life that now felt like a fiction. The photos on the mantelpiece, our wedding, our trip to Italy, us laughing at a company picnic, seemed to mock me. Was any of it real? I'd catch my reflection in a window and see a stranger, a pale, haunted woman with wide, terrified eyes. The world had shrunk to the four walls of our home, a prison of Richard's design. My mind, in a desperate attempt to find an anchor, kept drifting back in time, searching for the breadcrumbs, the warning signs I must have missed, and once I started looking, they were everywhere. It's a terrible kind of hindsight, the kind that illuminates all your past foolishness in excruciating detail. I remembered the very beginning of Innovate Dynamics. It wasn't just his dream, it was supposed to be our dream. I had a promising career in cybersecurity, working for a major financial institution. But Richard had this vision, this unshakable belief in his product. He was magnetic. He sold me on the dream just as he sold his first investors. "We're a team, Ellie," he'd said, his eyes shining with ambition. "Everything I build is for us." So I did what I thought a supportive partner should do. I took the entirety of a small inheritance my grandmother had left me, $50,000, and put it into his fledgling company. It was the seed that allowed everything else to grow. I didn't ask for shares, or a formal title, I just gave it to him. An act of faith, a foolish, naive act of faith. Then as the company grew, a subtle shift occurred. He needed me to manage the house, to host dinners for potential clients, to be the gracious, smiling wife on his arm at industry events. My own career was put on the back burner, then moved to the back of the stove, and finally taken off the heat altogether. It happened so gradually I barely noticed. He encouraged it, framing it as a luxury. "You don't need to work, darling. I've got this. I want to take care of you." It didn't sound like a demotion. It sounded like love. The dismissals started small. I'd try to talk to him about a new development in data encryption, and he'd pat my hand and say, "That's nice, honey," his eyes already glazing over. I'd built our home's network from scratch, a secure, robust system that was probably overkill for a suburban house, but it was something I enjoyed. It was my little patch of professional turf. He started referring to it as my hobby. At dinner parties, if someone asked what I did, he'd jump in with a charming laugh. Ellie handles our domestic server, keeps the Netflix running smoothly, you know. The men would chuckle, and I would feel a familiar hot sting of humiliation. I was reduced to the family IT support, the woman who manages the Wi-Fi password. He took my expertise and turned it into a cute domestic quirk. And then there was the book club, my Wednesday nights. That was the one thing that was unequivocally mine. After I'd left my job, a sense of isolation had started to creep in. I missed the camaraderie, the intellectual stimulation, so I reached out to a few women I'd known from my old field. We were all in the same boat, in one way or another, women in a male-dominated industry, feeling undervalued or sidelined. We started meeting on Wednesday nights. Richard immediately labeled it the book club, off to discuss Jane Austen with the ladies. He'd ask every Wednesday evening, the smirk never leaving his face. The condescension was a physical thing, a thick, cloying fog. I never corrected him. I never told him that my book club was actually the Athena Collective, a support group and professional network for a dozen of the most brilliant women I knew. I never told him that our discussions were about navigating venture capital funding, patent law, and the insidious sexism of the tech world. I let him believe it was about novels and tea, because in a way, his disdain was a shield. It kept my sanctuary pure. It was the one place he couldn't touch, couldn't diminish, because he didn't even know what it was. His arrogance was my secret garden's wall. The day after the detectives left, my phone buzzed. It was my friend Maya, a core member of the Athena Collective. "Ellie, you went dark." I was worried. "Everything okay?" Her voice, so normal and sane, broke through the spell of my despair. The tears I had been holding back finally came, hot and messy. I told her everything. The embezzlement, the police, the security logs, Richard's sickeningly perfect performance. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Maya's voice came back, but it was different. It was cold, hard, and laced with a fury that was almost terrifying. "That condescending prick," she said, her voice a low snarl. "I knew it. I always knew he couldn't stand it. He always hated that you were smarter than him. He had to tear you down to feel tall." Her anger was a lifeline. It validated the faint, flickering rage that was beginning to stir in the pit of my stomach. For the first time, I felt something other than fear and confusion. I felt the first spark of a fight. That evening the catalyst arrived. Richard came home from a day of presumably receiving sympathetic pats on the back at the office. He sat next to me on the sofa, taking my hands in his. His were warm, mine were like ice. "Ellie, darling," he began, his voice a soft, persuasive murmur. "I've been talking to a lawyer, a friend. He thinks we can make this go away, minimize the damage." I just stared at him, my face a blank mask. He took my silence as acquiescence. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folded document. He slid it onto the coffee table, right where the police evidence had been just a day before. "He drew this up," Richard continued, his gaze intense. "It's a confession. It just states that you were under extreme emotional distress, that you weren't thinking clearly. If you sign it, the lawyer is confident he can argue for diminished capacity. Maybe some therapy, a probationary period. You won't do much time, Ellie. A few months maybe. We can get through it. It's the only way to protect the family, to protect the company." I looked down at the paper. The words swam, but the intent was crystal clear. He wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to finalize the frame, to get me to willingly sign my own death warrant. He wanted me to confess to a crime I didn't commit to save him, to save his reputation, his company, his perfect life. My role in this drama was to be the tragic, crazy wife who took the fall. And in that instant, something inside me snapped. The fog of hurt, the haze of betrayal, it all burned away, replaced by an astonishing, terrifying clarity. It was like looking at him through a new lens, one that stripped away the years of affection and revealed the cold, calculating stranger beneath. This wasn't just about money. He wasn't just trying to cover his own crime. He was trying to erase me. He had taken my money, my career, my confidence, and now he was trying to take my freedom and my very identity. It wasn't about the money, it was about erasing me. The despair that had been choking me for 36 hours solidified into something hard and unyielding. It was resolve. I looked up from the confession, meeting his earnest, pleading gaze, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I wasn't afraid of him. I picked up the document, its weight feeling both insignificant and immense. "I need to think," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You're right. This is a big decision. I need a day." He smiled, a small, relieved smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, darling. Take all the time you need." He believed he had won. He believed I was just a broken woman making a sensible choice. He had no idea that I wasn't deciding whether to sign his confession. I was deciding how, exactly, I was going to burn his world to the ground. The moment Richard left for work the next morning, humming a cheerful tune, the house transformed from a prison into a war room. The pretense of the grieving, confused wife fell away like a shed skin. I made coffee, my movements sharp and purposeful. The fear was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, righteous anger. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated my friends. He had made the fatal mistake of assuming the woman who organized his social calendar was incapable of organizing his downfall. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself, clutching the warm mug. It was about justice. It was about survival. But a small, honest part of me whispered back, it wasn't about revenge until it was. My first call was to Maya. "Emergency meeting," I said. "No preamble. Tonight. Full assembly. I'm already drafting the email," she replied. "We're with you, Ellie. All of us." That evening, the women of the Athena Collective gathered not in my living room, but in a secure rented office space downtown that we used for more sensitive projects. The air crackled with energy. There were 12 of us in total, a formidable array of talent that Richard, in his infinite arrogance, had dismissed as a book club. There was Jasmine, a shark of a corporate lawyer, whose calm demeanor hid a razor-sharp legal mind. There was Sarah, a forensic accountant who could make spreadsheets sing and confessions weep. There was Chloe, a cybersecurity expert and white-hat hacker, who treated encrypted firewalls like a fun Sunday crossword. And there was Maya, my rock, a data scientist who could find patterns in chaos. I stood before them and laid it all out. I told them about the embezzlement, the faked digital trail, the security camera footage. I told them about the confession he wanted me to sign. A collective hiss of outrage went through the room. Jasmine was already pacing, her legal brain firing on all cylinders. "Okay, first, do not speak to him or the police again without me present. We need to file for a protective order. We can argue spousal coercion." I held up a hand, and the room fell silent. "He thinks he's built the perfect case," I said, my voice low and steady. "He thinks he has irrefutable proof that I was at my computer during every single transfer." I paused, letting the weight of his confidence hang in the air. "But he's a narcissist, and narcissists have blind spots. His blind spot is his contempt for me, for us." I looked around the room, at the faces of these brilliant, powerful women. "He doesn't know about our server." A slow smile spread across Chloe's face. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." Every Wednesday night, I continued, a surge of adrenaline making my voice tremble slightly, for the last 3 years. Every meeting, every presentation, every brainstorming session, it's all been recorded, live-streamed to our private server, hosted in Switzerland, with triple redundancy backups in Iceland. Sarah, the forensic accountant, leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Time-stamped?" To the millisecond, I confirmed. With geolocation data tagged to my phone, which is always with me in this room. The metadata is immutable, blockchain verified. It's a digital fortress. Jasmine stopped pacing. She looked at me, a slow, predatory grin spreading across her face. Ellie, that's not just an alibi. An alibi is defensive. This is a weapon. This is offensive. The energy in the room shifted from righteous anger to focused, lethal strategy. We weren't just a support group anymore. We were a conspiracy. The plan began to form, each woman adding her area of expertise. We realized quickly that the alibi was only step one. It proved I didn't do it. It didn't by itself prove he did. We needed to pivot from defense to offense. He used your IP address, Chloe mused, already typing furiously on her laptop. But if he wasn't physically at your desk, he must have used a remote access tool to control your machine from another location. Amateurs always leave traces. He's an amateur. I'll find it. And the money, Sarah added, pulling up a legal pad. $500,000 doesn't just evaporate. It has a destination. He would have used shell corporations, cutouts, but the chain is always there, if you know how to look. I'll follow the money. I guarantee it leads right back to him. Jasmine laid out the grand strategy. We don't go to detectives Harding and Chen with this. Not yet. They're working from a narrative Richard gave them. They'll be slow to pivot. We bypass them. We build a completely airtight, undeniable case. Then we take it straight to the other members of the board of directors at Innovate Dynamics. And simultaneously, we file a whistleblower report with the SEC. We don't just clear your name, Ellie. We take control of the entire narrative. We detonate this in the center of his professional life, not his personal one. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. It was perfect. Just as we were mapping out the first steps, my phone rang. The caller ID read Margaret Archer, Richard's mother. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I put the call on speaker. Eleanor. Dear. Her voice dripped with saccharine, condescending sympathy. We just heard the news. David and I are on our way over. Richard is just beside himself with worry. We can't imagine what could have possessed you to do such a thing. But you must know, the family will stand by him. We will get him through this. Her words hung in the silent room. She didn't even entertain the possibility of my innocence. In the Archer family narrative, Richard was the permanent hero, the golden child. If something went wrong, it must, by definition, be someone else's fault. And I was the designated scapegoat. The confirmation of their blind, unshakable loyalty to him was another log on the fire of my resolve. Thank you for your concern, Margaret. I said, my voice a mask of politeness. But I'm a little busy tonight. Perhaps another time. I hung up before she could reply. The 12 women in the room looked at me. Maya raised her coffee cup in a silent toast. The war had begun. And the Athena Collective was officially in session. For the next week, I lived a double life. To Richard, I was the broken, pliable wife, still thinking about his generous offer of a prison sentence. I was quiet, withdrawn and shuffled around the house in sweats, my face a mask of sorrow. I'd catch him watching me with a look of smug pity. He thought he was managing my decline. He had no idea he was witnessing the calm before the storm. The moment he was out the door, our house became the nerve center of a covert operation. The Athena Collective worked with a speed and efficiency that would have made the CIA blush. Chloe, fueled by an endless supply of energy drinks and a deep-seated hatred for arrogant men, was the first to strike gold. Got it, she announced, on a secure video call 3 days in. She shared her screen. He used a commercial remote access Trojan, or RAT, not very sophisticated, but he covered his tracks well, or so he thought. She pointed to a line of code. He routed his connection through a series of proxy servers to make it look like it was coming from overseas, but he got sloppy. He initiated the very first remote session from an IP address I traced to a coffee shop 2 blocks from his office, and he paid for his latte with his corporate credit card. I have the receipt. It was a small mistake, but it was the first thread. Chloe didn't stop there. She worked backwards, and using a vulnerability she discovered in the rat's software, she was able to access the logs on the originating device, Richard's work computer. It was a treasure trove. He tried to delete his search history, but deletion is never really deletion. Chloe recovered fragments. How to frame spouse for fraud. Best non-extradition countries for banking. Can remote access be traced by police? Signs of a nervous breakdown in women. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a meticulous student of his own treachery. While Chloe was digging through Richard's digital filth, Sarah was on the hunt for the money. She worked from her own office, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she navigated the labyrinthine world of international finance. He was clever, she admitted during one of our nightly briefings. The money was laundered through 3 shell companies, one in Delaware, one in Panama, one in Cyprus. Standard playbook stuff. Each transaction was designed to look like a legitimate payment for consulting services. But, I prompted, sensing a breakthrough. But the final destination is always the weak point, Sarah said with a grin. The money, all $487,000 of it, landed in a single private wealth account at a bank in the Cayman Islands. She paused for dramatic effect. An account opened 6 months ago under the name David Archer. I stared at her. David Archer, Richard's father. He'd used his own father's name. It was both arrogant and idiotic. He was so certain of his own cleverness, so sure I would crumble and confess, that he'd left a glaring, undeniable link back to his own family. It was a classic blunder, born of contempt for his opponent. Meanwhile, Jasmine was transforming this raw data into a legal weapon. She drafted cease and desist letters. She compiled Chloe's forensic report and Sarah's financial audit into a thick, spiral-bound volume that felt as heavy as a tombstone. She researched the other 2 members of the board of Innovate Dynamics, a grizzled venture capitalist named Marcus Thorne, and a sharp, no-nonsense older woman, a titan of the industry named Evelyn Reed. Jasmine prepared a personalized dossier on each of them, anticipating their questions, their motivations, their pressure points. As our case grew stronger, Richard's composure began to crack. He was no longer the calm, consoling husband. He was agitated, jumpy. His phone rang at all hours. I could overhear snippets of his conversations with Detective Harding. The police were no longer taking his story at face value. Anonymous tips, carefully planted by Chloe, had started to muddy the waters. A witness had supposedly seen him near a specific bank on one of the transfer dates. The detectives were asking him for alibis now. He started confronting me, his frustration boiling over. "What have you been doing, Ellie? Who have you been talking to?" he demanded one evening, grabbing my arm. "Did you say something to the police?" I looked at him, my eyes wide and empty, channeling the broken woman he wanted me to be. "I haven't talked to anyone, Richard," I whispered. "I'm just thinking, like you told me to." My passivity seemed to infuriate him more than any argument would have. He couldn't understand why I hadn't signed the confession yet. His perfect plan had a timeline, and I was derailing it with my inaction. His parents, Margaret and David, began calling daily. Their tone had shifted from syrupy pity to sharp-edged impatience. "Eleanor, this has gone on long enough." Margaret snapped at me over the phone. "Richard is under a tremendous amount of stress because of your selfishness. You need to think about the family. You need to sign that paper and put an end to this ordeal. It's for the good of everyone. For the good of the family." That phrase, once a comforting mantra, now sounded like a threat. Their panic was the canary in the coal mine. It told me our silent offensive was working. They could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet, even if they didn't know why. Richard's carefully constructed world was beginning to tremble, and his panic was the most satisfying confirmation I could have asked for. The silent takeover was proceeding exactly as planned. The moment of truth arrived, not with a bang, but with a politely worded email. Jasmine, acting on my behalf, had requested an emergency meeting with the full board of directors of Innovate Dynamics. The stated purpose was to discuss a matter of grave financial and ethical concern to the company. Richard, as CEO and majority shareholder, couldn't refuse the meeting without raising suspicion. He agreed, likely assuming it was a desperate, last-ditch effort on my part to plead my case. He probably pictured me showing up in tears, begging for mercy. He was about to be very, very disappointed. We met in the company's main conference room, a sterile space with a long, polished mahogany table and a panoramic view of the city skyline. Richard sat at the head of the table, flanked by his two board members, Marcus Thorne and Evelyn Reed. He looked confident, almost bored, like a king granting an audience to a troublesome peasant. I sat on the opposite side of the table, with Jasmine beside me, our thick, bound report placed squarely in front of us. Richard began, his tone dripping with condescension. "All right, Ellie, Jasmine. We're all very busy people. What is this about?" Jasmine smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "Mr. Archer, we're here today to discuss the source of the recent embezzlement from this company." Richard leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "I believe the police have a rather firm handle on that. As tragic as it is, my wife, the police have been operating on incomplete and deliberately falsified information." Jasmine cut in, her voice slicing through his arrogance. She slid a copy of our report across the table to Marcus and another to Evelyn. She pushed a third one toward Richard. "This report contains a full forensic analysis of the fraud. I suggest you turn to page 12. Evelyn Reed, a woman known for her sharp intellect and sharper tongue, put on a pair of reading glasses and opened the report. Marcus followed suit. Richard just stared at his copy, as if it were a venomous snake. Page 12, Jasmine continued, her voice filling the silent room, contains the immutable time-stamped video evidence from a private server, showing my client, Eleanor Archer, in a live-streamed meeting in downtown San Jose at the exact moment of every single fraudulent transaction. Her alibi is not just solid, it is a mathematical certainty. I watched Evelyn's eyes scan the page, her expression shifting from curiosity to intense focus. Marcus Thorne let out a low whistle. Richard's face had gone pale. "If you'll now turn to page 34, Jasmine went on, her tone relentless, "you'll find a complete digital forensic trace of the remote access Trojan used to perpetrate the fraud from my client's computer. You will note it was installed and operated from a terminal located in this very building. Specifically, from the computer in your office, Mr. Archer." Richard shot to his feet. "This is absurd. It's slander. She's a desperate woman trying to deflect blame." Evelyn held up a hand, silencing him without even looking up from the report. "Let her finish, Richard." And finally, Jasmine said, delivering the killing blow, "If you turn to Appendix C, on page 57, you will find the full report from our forensic accountant, tracing the full sum of the embezzled funds. Through a series of shell corporations, the money was ultimately deposited into a private wealth account in the Cayman Islands." She paused, letting her eyes rest on Richard. "An account held in the name of David Archer. Your father." The silence in the room was absolute. Evelyn Reed slowly closed the report and took off her glasses. She looked not at me, but at Richard, and her gaze was pure ice. "Richard," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "This is damning." Marcus Thorne, looking stunned, pushed his chair back. "The board will need to discuss this. In private." Jasmine and I stood. "Of course," she said. "We've also taken the liberty of forwarding a copy of this report to the Securities and Exchange Commission." As we walked out of the conference room, leaving Richard to face the ruins of his career, I felt a profound shift in the universe. The power had moved. The weight that had been crushing me for weeks had been transferred in its entirety to him. Richard didn't come home for hours. When he finally walked through the door, he was a different man. The charm, the confidence, the arrogance. It was all gone, stripped away, leaving behind something raw and ugly. He was a cornered animal. "You," he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage that was terrifying in its intensity. "You ruined me. You couldn't just prove you were innocent, could you? You had to burn it all down. You'll pay for this, Ellie. I swear to God, you will pay." He advanced on me, his face contorted. For a second, I thought he might hit me. But then, as if a switch had been flipped, his entire demeanor changed. The rage collapsed into a desperate, pleading wreck. His eyes filled with tears. "Ellie, baby, please," he whimpered, reaching for me. I flinched away. "We can fix this. I know we can. I'll go to the police. I'll retract the statement. I'll say I was confused, that I made a mistake. We can sell the company, move away, go somewhere no one knows us. Just you and me. Like it used to be." It was a pathetic, transparent performance. When he saw it wasn't working, he shifted again. This time to blame. "You drove me to this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You were always so distant, so cold. Always off with your stupid friends at that stupid book club. You were never here for me. You made me do it." Just then the doorbell rang. A frantic, insistent peal. Richard's parents, Margaret and David, burst in without waiting for an answer. They had clearly been summoned. Margaret's face was a mask of fury. David just looked gray and old. "You ungrateful witch," Margaret shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "After everything we've done for you, after the life Richard has given you, how could you do this to him? To our family?" They genuinely believed it. In their twisted, self-serving world, Richard's criminal actions were my fault. His betrayal was a consequence of my supposed failings as a wife. Their logic was so warped, so profoundly broken, that it was almost fascinating. They were drowning, and instead of looking for a life raft, they were trying to blame the ocean. The power had not just shifted, it had created a new reality, one they were utterly unprepared to live in. The final confrontation played out in the living room that had once been the stage for our perfect life. Richard was pacing like a caged tiger. Margaret was still spewing venom, a torrent of accusations about my character, my gratitude, my wifely duties. David stood silently by the fireplace, his face ashen, looking like a man who had just seen his own ghost. I was sitting calmly on the sofa, the same sofa where this nightmare had begun. But I was no longer the victim, I was the arbiter. I let them exhaust themselves, their panic and rage filling the room like a toxic gas. When Margaret finally paused to draw a breath, I spoke, my voice cutting through the hysteria with quiet, surgical precision. "Richard," I began, my gaze fixed on him, "the board has suspended you. They have frozen your assets. The SEC has opened a formal investigation based on the evidence we provided." He stopped pacing and stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "The money, all of it, is in an account in your father's name in the Cayman Islands," I continued, my voice even. "The transfers were initiated from your work computer, using a Trojan you installed yourself. And while your fake security logs show me sitting at my desk, I have 156 hours of time-stamped, geolocated, and blockchain-verified video evidence showing me in a live-streamed meeting with 11 other women for every single fraudulent transaction." I let that sink in. Then I turned my attention to his mother. "And Margaret," I said, my voice softening slightly, but losing none of its steel. "When you talk about the life Richard has given me, and everything you've done, I feel I should remind you of something. The $50,000 seed money that started Innovate Dynamics, the money that allowed Richard to build this life for himself, came from my inheritance, from my grandmother, an inheritance that, according to the prenuptial agreement that you and David insisted I sign, was supposed to remain my separate, non-marital property. So, in a way, Richard didn't just embezzle from his company, he embezzled from me, twice." The mention of the prenup, their own legal shield now turned against them, seemed to finally break through Margaret's wall of denial. Her face crumpled. David visibly flinched, as if I had struck him. It was in that moment of stunned silence that the doorbell rang again. This time, the knock was firm, official. I stood and opened the door. Detectives Harding and Chen stood on the porch. But this time, they didn't look at me. Their eyes were fixed on the scene in the living room. "Ellie," Harding said, giving me a brief, almost apologetic nod. He and Chen stepped inside. They walked past me, their focus entirely on Richard. "Richard Archer," Detective Harding said, his voice flat and official. "You are under arrest for felony embezzlement, insurance fraud, and filing a false police report." As Detective Chen took out the handcuffs, the last of Richard's composure shattered. He looked at me, his face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. It was the look of a man who had been outplayed at his own game, defeated by a person he considered an inferior. As they led him away, he didn't say a word, he just held my gaze, and I met it without flinching. Margaret let out a short, sharp cry and collapsed onto a nearby armchair, her face in her hands. David, his shoulders slumped, simply stared at the empty doorway through which his golden child had just disappeared. The great Archer family, the pillars of the community, had crumbled into dust in the space of 10 minutes. My new reality was beginning, built upon the ashes of their old one. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and personal reinvention. The divorce was swift and uncontested. Faced with the mountain of evidence, Richard took a plea deal that would see him spend the next 5 to 7 years in a medium-security prison. His parents, Margaret and David, faced their own legal battles over their potential complicity in the money laundering, a scandal that stripped them of their social standing and much of their wealth. The beautiful house was sold as part of the asset liquidation. I didn't want it anyway. It was a mausoleum of a life I was glad to leave behind. I moved into a bright, airy apartment downtown with a small balcony overlooking a park. It was smaller than my old house, but it felt infinitely larger because it was all mine. The silence was a comfort, not a threat. Evelyn Reed, the formidable woman from the board, became an unexpected mentor. Impressed by the methodical way we had uncovered the fraud, the board of Innovate Dynamics hired the Athena Collective on a consulting contract to help them restructure the company and implement new, rigorous security protocols. I found myself at the head of a conference table again, not as a supportive wife, but as a respected expert. My voice was heard. My ideas were valued. I was, for the first time in a decade, fully and completely myself. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Richard. I don't feel anger anymore, or hatred. That all burned out, leaving behind a strange, empty peace. I just feel a kind of detached pity for him. He was a man so consumed by his own ego that he couldn't bear to be in a partnership of equals. His need to be the sun was so absolute that he had to extinguish any other light around him. He thought my greatest weakness was the part of my life he disdained the most. He never imagined that my community, my boring little book club, would be my greatest strength. He thought he was writing my final chapter, but he only ended up providing the catalyst for my new beginning. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But looking back, I don't think this was ever truly about revenge. It was about survival. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming my own story from a man who tried to steal it and write a tragic ending. He made a critical error in his calculations. He tried to frame a woman who had been taken for granted, but he didn't realize he was actually framing a cybersecurity expert with a team of brilliant, loyal, and fiercely protective friends. He underestimated a woman who reads, and he underestimated a woman who codes. He never once considered that they could be the very same person, and that was the fatal flaw in his perfect plan. So now I have to ask you, when you're pushed to the absolute limit, when someone tries to take everything from you, what's the right response? Did I go too far by not just clearing my name, but by systematically dismantling his entire world? Or was it a completely justified case of the punishment fitting the crime? I genuinely love to know what you think, so please, let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever had someone in your life completely underestimate you, I want to hear your story. Sharing these experiences is how we remind each other of our own strength. Thank you so much for listening to mine. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content just like this.